everyone, and welcome to another episode of Monsters Manifested, right here on DM Tools with MaxMcCool. On today's episode, we're going to be covering the Manus. So, without further ado, let's jump right into it. The Manus' stat block can be found on page 60 of the Monster Manual, sharing it with the Hezro, and its lore, like the lore of all other lesser demons, can be found on page 53. So, let's begin there. Souls of evil creatures that descend to the lower planes are transformed into Manus, the lowest form of demon kind. These wretched fiends attack any non-demon they see, and they are called to the material plane by those seeking to sow death and chaos. Orcus, the Prince of Undeath, has the power to transform Manus into undead monsters, most often ghouls and shadows. Other demon lords feed on Manus, destroying them utterly. Otherwise, killing a Manus causes it to dissipate into a cloud of reeking vapor that reforms into another Manus after one day. And that's all there is when it comes to the lore of the Manus. Short and sweet, as are most of these descriptions of lesser demons, but some interesting points to note that I think we could use in our adventures, so I'll be sure to keep those in mind. But for the time being, let's move on to the stat block, shall we? The Manus is a small fiend, demon, with a chaotic evil alignment. It has an armor class of 9, hit points that average 9 or 2d6 plus 2, and it has a movement speed of 20 feet. The Manus has a strength of 10, a dexterity of 9, a constitution of 13, an intelligence of 3, a wisdom of 8, and a charisma of 4. Its damage resistances include cold, fire, and lightning, and it is immune to the damage type of poison. The Manus is also immune to the charmed, frightened, and poisoned conditions. It has the senses of dark vision for 60 feet, and a passive perception of 9. The Manus understands the language of Abyssal, but cannot speak, and is a challenge rating of 1/8. On to the actions. Or rather, action. Claws is a melee weapon attack with a +2 to hit, a reach of 5 feet on one target. On a hit, it does an average of 5 or 2d4 slashing damage. And that's all there is when it comes to the stats of the Manus. So not much in the way of lore, not much in the way of stats and abilities and stuff like that, but I think that there's still enough that can be done with the Manus to make an interesting scenario or encounter with them. So, with all that said, let's move on to some adventure crafting. Okay, so immediately what I take from the Manus is that the Manus is a low challenge creature, so seemingly a demon designed for early play, early levels, lower levels, which can be pretty refreshing, especially if the dungeon master and or players are a little burnt out or feeling like taking on kobolds and goblins and stuff like that are sort of becoming samey-same. You can throw in a Manus or a few of them to spice things up and perhaps allow for a level of intrigue with your players as to what this new monster is, where it came from, how it came to be, stuff like that. So immediately my mind goes to something a bit more morbid and creepy when thinking of implementing the Manus. The first idea that popped right into my head was something to the effect of like perhaps an asylum, let's say, an abandoned asylum in a town or a city that has long been decrepit or dilapidated or something like that. And for some reason, the people of the town have been avoiding it, or perhaps there's some history or rumors that a curse was placed upon said asylum or facility due to, let's say, the mistreatment of the patients from the past. You know, perhaps it was a more barbaric time. Perhaps it was seen more as a distasteful place, you know, kind of where like the invalids of society and people went, something like that. You could also present it as some form of a, let's say, purification place, you know, like perhaps rather than your typical asylum, it was something like a structure that was implemented by the clerics of the area and the holy people of the area as a safe place to house and perhaps try to cure individuals who had been perceived to be possessed by demons or some kind of nefarious entity. And so what's happened is the old abbey or the old asylum has started to become more active, let's say. There's sort of rumblings and stuff of that nature. And you can implement the Manus in such a way that, due to the fact that they're small fiends and they look relatively humanoid, although a little disfigured and with rotting flesh and teeth and stuff like that, you could present it as perhaps the housing area of the Manus, or the spot in which these Manus lurk is the children's ward or some form of youth wing of the building. So you could immediately invoke this sense of apprehension and discomfort at the table for your players, because presumably they're heroes and they don't particularly feel excited or eager to dispatch younger people or children, even if they are no longer what they once were, even if they do appear to be zombies or these sort of disfigured monsters. But the job has to get done. Perhaps that's the task they were charged with by the ruler of the town. Perhaps they were charged with this task from the top cleric in the town or city, something like that. Perhaps they don't have the will or the heart to do it themselves, so they enlist the services of the adventurers to sort of clear out this infested structure so that these tortured souls may rest once again. And you can generate a sort of recurring problem for your players where they have to come back and sort this out once more, due to the fact that the Manus will burst into a cloud of noxious gas, essentially, and then return in a day. So they require some means of getting rid of these monstrous creatures permanently. So perhaps you could give them something to the effect of an item that allows them to do so and dispatch these creatures in a permanent fashion. That could be as easy as something like holy water, or perhaps there's an amulet or something like that that the holy person in the town gives them as a means of permanently eliminating the Manus from the material plane. You could also implement something like a gate or a tear or something like that within the structure itself, perhaps in the chambers and the catacombs beneath it, perhaps in the depths of the abbey or asylum or what have you. There's a shrine or a portal to the abyss. Perhaps there is a larger scale demon who's requisitioning more and more Manus to cause pandemonium and havoc in the town for the sake of serving a greater demon, or for the sake of bringing up its own power and reputation within the ranks of the demons. Or you could even implement it as something to the effect of a shrine that was erected there in that place to cause as much chaos and havoc by another sentient individual, namely a person of the material plane or a group of people. And you can go back to something like cults or a necromancer or an evil sorcerer of some sort, or perhaps even an individual who is not necessarily a worshiper of demons or demonic lords or anything like that, but they've stumbled upon or learned about some means of being able to control demonic entities, and they want to use that to further their prospects, further their desires of perhaps reigning over the town or ruling the land, something like that. And the first step that they have taken is creating this sort of shrine or generator or portal or something to that effect, ritual place that will summon these Manus that they can control to do their bidding for them. And then you can drop threads there for your players to pick up on and allow them to investigate it further. Another way that you could use the Manus in higher tier play, let's say, once your players are at a higher level and you'd like to start implementing demons, or you'd like to use the Manus because it's different, or As previously mentioned, perhaps you need a change of pace or of flavor just to spice things up. What you could do is you could use the Manus as a horde monster due to the fact that it's only 1/8 CR or challenge rating. And you could create a horde of Manus that are effectively running through perhaps a dungeon, or perhaps running through a town, or perhaps have found their domicile in some underground structure, perhaps a cave or inside of a mountain. You could use something to the effect of there was some sort of excavation or some sort of prospecting that was done, maybe some sort of archaeological dig, something to that effect, where they stumbled upon a location or an item or a ruin or something like that that has suddenly awoken the undead, or so they believe. And you can have your players going up against these creatures, these hordes and hordes of creatures, thinking that they're taking on what appear to be sort of disfigured humanoid zombie-esque creatures, but for some reason more and more of them keep coming, or they appear to have no desire necessarily to consume the flesh of the living. They just seem to come in and cause havoc, and even if they're stopped or if they're killed, they disappear into a cloud of smoke, and the next day two take the place of one, as it were. So you could throw in ways of keeping it fresh so that your players come to the conclusion that, okay, this seems to be something like zombification, but it's not quite the same thing. And I think you could create a very interesting combat encounter just using a horde of Manus, and perhaps there's a chamber or a room where there's a number of them where they're spewing out of a portal or a ritual circle or, a crack in the wall or something like that, and they're forcing their way through to take on the adventurers. And perhaps as the adventurers dispatch more and more and more of them, what ends up happening is that the room begins to fill up with this noxious gas, and you could then implement something to the effect of a constitution save or check, give them a roll that they have to use in order to see if they can keep breathing within this closed off environment without passing out due to the noxious gas. Or perhaps you create a timer where the players have only so much time to dispatch these Manus and escape the room before they suffocate, because all the oxygen is consumed and all that's left is this putrid fume that is left by the Manus once they are destroyed. Another way that I could see the Manus being used in an effective way would be to the effect of something more investigatory or murder mystery, if you would. So you could create a scenario where perhaps there is a neighborhood or a town or a kingdom that has recently been accosted by some form of serial killer or murderer, something like that, and nobody can quite figure out who it is that's doing it. There's perhaps an individual there that is a suspect, but there's no evidence to pin them to these crimes. You could implement a scenario where perhaps they had recently released an individual who had been arrested or put into the dungeon for the crime of murder, but they'd served their time, or they had been reformed and rehabilitated, and therefore they were released. And then the presumption is that as soon as they were released, of course, they went back to their old ways, given the chance. And you could sort of have that as a red herring, or as a means for your players, for your adventurers to collect information and give them a bit of a red herring. They could investigate that individual and interrogate them to see if what they're saying is true, if they seem to be sincere or genuine. Perhaps there's an individual who was the neighbor of the prisoner at the time while they were in the dungeons, and perhaps they gain information about this other individual who really was resentful and promised to lay a curse upon the land and the people who wrongfully convicted them, stuff like that. And in doing so, made a promise to a demon lord or a lesser demon. And the deal made was that for their release or their freedom or ability to escape, they would create a temple or a shrine or an effigy or something to that effect that would allow them to manifest these demons into the material plane to cause havoc. And then with that, your players have to follow information, have to follow clues, have to figure out what's going on and perhaps investigate some murder scenes. Perhaps they have to find said effigy or shrine and destroy it. Perhaps they don't think that far ahead, or they don't have all of the information provided to them. And so what they do is they find the Manus, they dispatch it. Everything's fine and dandy. They get their coin. They enjoy themselves. They feel good about succeeding. And the following day, there's yet another murder in the same way with the same methodology. And the players themselves are accused of failing to complete the task. So they have to go back and try to figure out where they went wrong or what they missed, which can lead to more investigation and sort of mystery solving, if you would. I think that could be a pretty solid adventure if you were going the route of more detective murder mystery style of campaign, or if you wanted to just change the pace a bit of your campaign or adventures for your players at the table by just giving them a bit of a different environment to try to go through, especially if they've become very used to the sort of typical format that you run your adventures in, right? Be it kick down the door and kill the bad guys, be it more large scale sort of glorious combat, heroic challenges, puzzles, something like that. Just a way to throw something in to spice things up, make things a little different, or a way to further along a theme or style of adventure that you enjoy implementing, but changing it up a little bit with the type of monster or creature that you use as the culprit. All in all, I think the Manus is a pretty cool monster. It's an interesting demon. It's one of the more different demons amongst the demons because so far it appears to be the most humanoid. It looks like a zombie, kind of not exactly there, but some sort of mutated zombie. And I think that you can take advantage of its human-esque form to create a lot of twists and turns for your players. You know, where you sort of leave them guessing as to what were we dealing with here? Are we dealing with a human that was reanimated? And that's why they're sort of twisted, gnarled versions of what they once were. Are we dealing with some kind of morbid creation of a mad scientist? Or are we dealing with a form of cursed individual, perhaps, or restless soul, if you would, that has unfinished business on the material plane and therefore will continue to return? Right? The Manus seems to me to be something almost akin to something like a creature you would hear about in ghost stories where there's some sort of conflict and horror that takes place. Some courageous, willful individuals take on that monstrous horror. They overcome the monstrous horror. They succeed. They ride off into the sunset. But it was all for naught because the next day the monster returned and continued on type thing. But that's all I got for you fine folks today when it comes to the Manus. Again, as I said, a very interesting monster. And I think you could go a lot of ways with it, even though there's not much in the way of lore and stats, which while it can be seen as kind of limiting, it is also somewhat liberating because it leaves you as the dungeon master open to throw in tweaks and changes and additions, anything like that to the Manus to make it unique to yourself or your style or the style at the table or to the style of play that the people at your table enjoy. But once again, I'd like to thank you all very much for tuning in. I appreciate it very, very much. On next week's episode, we are going to be covering the Merilith, which should be a little different. It seems to be something like a Naga or Medusa style demon. A much higher challenge rating with a lot more in terms of actions, reactions, abilities, and stuff like that. So we'll have a bit more to bite into and figure out what to do with. But until then, thank you all very much once again. If you enjoy the podcast, enjoy listening to it, please feel free to subscribe to the podcast. Feel free to leave a rating, leave a review where you can, anything like that, as it helps the channel out, helps me out. I'd highly appreciate that. If you're listening to this episode on YouTube, please feel free to like, comment, share, subscribe, hit the bell thing for notifications, all of that fun stuff, as it would help me out. But until next time, have a good day, everyone.